The term philosophy was first coined by Pythagoras, according to one 1st or 2nd century Neoplatonic author. And philosophy in the Pythagorean conception was not a system of abstraction or an explanatory framework. It was a mode of conduct, a method of comportment towards life and desire. I expect that this way of life traces back to the tradition of the sannyasi in India. This was a social movement that had a historical basis in the arrival of the Indo-Aryan conquerors, some would say. I believe we can now trace it relatively definitively to the Grey Ware archaeological complex, or something like that. Roughly around 1300, 1200 BC. And after that time, almost immediately after, the sannyasi tradition began with wise men going off into the wilderness to practice yoga and asceticism. This looks to me like a reaction of the indigenous population to this nomadic invasion. The Indo-Aryans did practice nomadic pastoralism. They were familiar with the technologies of civilization. They had been conversant with the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, which is to the north of Pakistan. It's like southeast of the Caspian Sea, I believe, roughly. That may also have been where Zoroaster was from, some scholars speculate. But the Indo-Aryans that divided into eventually the Zoroastrians and the Hindus, or the Vedantists, they had intercourse with the BMAC and learned a lot of very advanced technological information and probably some spiritual information that was practiced there. A lot of people don't realize that the Eastern Fertile Crescent region was more advanced than the Western Fertile Crescent region from the very earliest settlements. If you look at a site like Kordik Tepe, which is in modern-day Turkey, but it's in the far east of Turkey, that is more sophisticated than any of the sites you're going to find in Palestine. And this Iranian element, the far southeastern component of the Fertile Crescent, had a number of cities that were very developed from an early time, and an offshoot of this technological complex was Mehrgar in modern-day Pakistan. And Mehrgar quickly became the technologically most sophisticated place on Earth. They had teeth drilling, and just so you know, this population, they likely had influences from the southeast, from India, and maybe even from Southeast Asia, or like the traits that we would observe in those people would be similar to modern day Southeast Asians. Obviously, we're dealing with totally different ethnic stocks at this point in history. But the Iranian Neolithic population was part of the constitution of the Yamna. So they had ancestors, the Indo-Aryans had ancestors going back to the same stock that founded the Dravidians. A lot of people think that the Dravidians are the dark-skinned people of southern India. That's false. The Dravidians were the ruling class of the Indus Valley civilization, and they were likely, on the whole, lighter than the actual indigenous population of India. They also came from Iran. So they descended from the Iranian Neolithic genetic cluster. Part of the Yamna traces its ancestry to the same. And so there was an affinity a genetic affinity between the Indo-Aryan people that migrated to Pakistan and the local people who ran formerly the Indus Valley civilization, which was the largest civilization in the world up until that time, and it was also seemingly the most technologically advanced. They did massive irrigation work out of necessity, because the northwest of India and obviously Pakistan is very arid. But they also had dentistry. They had a system of writing that we've yet to decipher. If that script ever is deciphered, it's going to change a lot of our conceptions of history, and particularly impact how we look at Hinduism in its relations to the rest of the Indo-European tradition. But anyway, how I think the sannyasi tradition emerged was the priest class, more or less, broadly speaking, not necessarily institutionally, but just the natural priest class, if you will, of the Indus Valley civilization reacted to this invasion, and their civilization was probably already in decline. They were probably going to collapse one way or the other. Barbarians don't generally cause civilizational collapses. They're just what seals the deal, more or less. So the priest class would have gone off to escape the nomadic invaders into the woods to practice their ancient spiritual traditions, which probably do go back to the Iranian Neolithic. Maybe it goes back to Göbekli Tepe as well. That's still the oldest thing that we know of in the Neolithic. So, yeah, why did I even get into this anthropology sidetrack, though? Oh yeah, because I was talking about Pythagoreanism. I did want to just have a discursive talk, which I sometimes do. I make room for that. Some people like listening to this sort of thing. Others enjoy more of like a focused discussion. So anyway, I think the sannyasi tradition, the Indo-Aryans were gradually assimilated into that. They were curious what these people were doing in the woods, and they saw the ruins. This was an extremely impressive civilization. They knew about it. They saw it in its height because the Indo-European people got around while the Indus Valley civilization was still thriving. They had commerce with them, maybe intermediated through the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex in part, but they knew the accomplishments of these people, and so naturally they would want to go and seek advice from these people, and they probably blended at a very early time to form a new ruling class. Now, if you read Plato's 7th letter, you will hear him, or I guess read from him, a description of what he intended to do in Syracuse. I've mentioned before that Plato's political ambitions failed. I was not talking about the academy. I was talking about his attempted intervention on the behalf of his friend Dion in the tyranny of Dionysius, who had inherited his position from his father. And Sicily at that time, Syracuse was in eastern Sicily. It was a Greek colony. The Greek colonies were being threatened. Barbarians were at the gate, so to speak. And the Syracusans, the Greek Syracusans, were falling into local ways of life. Greek perception of Italian and Sicilian conduct was that they were effete, indulgent, and Plato observed this, and so he thought the whole philosophy king idea is that if he could reform a tyrant to become a true philosopher, not someone who is into like Neoplatonism as a philosophical abstract system, but someone who changed their mode of life, renounced desire and material things, and sought wisdom, if a tyrant became that, they could become a true king and initiate some kind of golden age. So that may have been what happened in India. The sannyasi, how did it come to be that the Brahmin are at the top of the social hierarchy there. Yes, the kings, the political rulers, are not part of the Brahmin class, but they exerted an outsized influence. The same sort of thing happened with the Persian civilization. The Zoroastrian priests did have a large influence on statecraft in Persia. And these were two very advanced civilizations up until the time of classical Greece. They only really fell, Persia only really, India arguably never did. It's still a living civilization from that very early time. There have been revolutions and new ruling classes have come in, but there's still a Brahmin class today that still has extraordinary social influence, although they are losing their spiritual traditions. But anyway, like Persia declined with the rise of the Roman Empire, and that is possibly because their conception of Zoroastrianism became rigid and abstraction focused, because once you set up a cosmology and a metaphysical scheme, the tendency is to hypostasize these elements and have some kind of absolute faith in them. You stop being interested in philosophy, which is, remember, a mode of conduct, and you start just being interested in the ideas for themselves. So this is well in line with Plato's conception of what he wanted to happen. Now, possibly what ended up happening was that the Platonic Academy system created a network of people who held this general idea in mind, and that culminated eventually in the rise of Constantine. Because you can see a firm line of traditional conduct from the Platonists to the Cynics to the Christians. The Cynics acted very similar to the early Christians. That is the Hellenic influence there. And the idea that, how did Catholic Europe operate? With a priest class with philosophy at heart, an ascetic tradition at heart, guiding the action of the ruling class, the Kshatriya, if you will. So that's how I contextualize Plato, and Plato is following off of the Pythagorean school, and all of it can really be traced back to, historically, it looks like to me, the tradition of the sannyasi. But you can really go farther back than that, because what was, and I've talked about this several times before, what was the tradition of shamanism? Now, first of all, Eliade, Mircea Eliade, has a book on shamanism in which he concludes that contemporary shamanism is mostly inherited from Buddhism, which is likely correct. But there was some kind of ancient shamanic tradition. We can see that from the cave paintings at Lascaux. There's shamanic archetypes in this kind of parietal art all around Europe. I don't know about Siberia exactly, but when we think shaman today, we think about Siberia. But anyway, the shaman archetypically was someone who was outcasted from the group. His persona was shattered. He didn't construct a persona. And he either learned to bring up masks voluntarily or as a byproduct of some kind of trance state or intervention of a higher spiritual agency or lower spiritual agency. But anyway, because at an early age their mask, their persona was broken, they had to reconstruct it somehow and in a way that gave them far greater agency. Now, part of this process of successful reconstruction of the persona would have been an ascetic practice. If you're outside of the community, what else do you have to do? That's the circumstance of the sannyasi in India. Some people would say that because of some artistic depictions of people in yoga postures found in the Indus Valley civilization ruins, some people would say that, well, yoga was already practiced back then, and that really most of Hinduism comes from that early time. And then people will link up certain stories in the Mahabharata to ruins found from from that ancient civilization and not the Indo-Aryan element. So, there was obviously a synthesis that went on, but I suspect that the yogic practices gained an ascendancy, particularly after the decline of the great cities, because the old priest class that survived had nowhere else to go and nothing else to do but reflect. But yeah, the general principle there is an important one to grasp. That is what philosophy is about. Originally, in its original conception, and that is what Plato advocated. Plato was not a builder of abstract systems primarily, and he followed the Pythagorean principle that you do not accept students who refuse to reform their conduct. Like Dionysius did consult Plato and wanted Plato to guide him, but Plato insisted first on getting Dionysius interested in philosophy and interested in getting away from the circle of friends that were corrupting him. This failed though, so Plato was not successful. And then if you read the Laws, it just reads to me like someone with a broken spirit, in part. I'm not even sure about the timeline if this was written after this incident, but in later life, it seems like Plato probably started drinking some and just losing his earnest commitment to the truth that he probably gained from inspiration from Socrates. But in the Laws, he talks about how before you're 30, you should have no wine at all. But then after, when you're 40, you can have a few glasses with dinner. And then by the time you're old, go ahead and get drunk, because you're not gonna need your body anyway for physical labor. You don't have long left to go. Go ahead and enjoy it. And that's definitely an exaggeration of what he says, but it looks to me like this is the mentality of somebody who's kind of given up. So that's kind of why I see there's a shortcoming in Plato, just from a personal perspective. I've said in the past that I believe in a philosopher at a personal level due to their conduct, not because of their system. Schopenhauer had his own limitations. He wasn't just a philosophical pessimist, he was also a misanthrope and a genuine what's the word for it? Misogynistic person. He really did not like women, disproportionate to their genuine qualities, I think. Although he was very accurate in many of the things that he observed on women. But yeah, Schopenhauer likewise had certain failings, and especially in volume 2 of The World as Will and Representation, you start to see some of these shortcomings come up in the reasoning process. Now, part of that may just be cognitive decline. We peak, around 30, and then gradually we think slower and slower. But maybe it's inevitable. Great philosophers don't generally die great unless they die young. There's always a decline period. No one's perfect. But what I wanted to focus on was this conception of philosophy, because it has relevance to us. One of the other things that Plato says in the 7th letter is that there's no surer sign of good character than the presence of true and loyal friends. And that's not just having people there around you to commiserate with or to enjoy good times with. That's having people who you can really rely on. And I share Plato's opinion that the only true form of friendship is one based on philosophy. If you can't talk to someone about the deepest issues, you're not really their friend, not in a lasting sense. Although there's a flip side of that, everything in moderation. So if you have a friendship solely based on intellectual considerations, this might be a cope, it might be a way of dealing with a lack of social adjustment that two people share mutually. And so their intellectualization as a psychological defense mechanism will feed off of each other, and this will be like a source of consolation for them being outcasts in their social circles or something like that. But genuine philosophy, again, is not just intellectualization, it's also a mode of conduct. If you're encouraging your friends to lead a better life and actually get intimately involved in that, then it's a true friendship, and those friendships are very rare. So that's what we need. So when I say, like, in order to integrate a group of people, to create a communications network, to organize our activities, effectively distribute the executive, and then start to build a strategy to combat people who may want to kill us, in a nonviolent way, of course, the philosophy I'm talking about is not merely abstract, although we do have to agree at an abstract level. But this is kind of a propedeutic to that level of philosophical consensus, and the Pythagoreans agreed with me on this. First, you have to reform your conduct, and you do that through good companionship. There's no better way of arriving at good character than surrounding yourself with men of good character. So you have to talk to people and not just watch YouTube videos. And I said that in my last video, but we really do have a problem here where people are not communicating in an honest way. And people need to talk to others. I'm very available, but very few people actually come out to contact me. So maybe that's me, maybe that's just me being intimidating in a certain respect. I can understand that. But I am fairly understanding, and I've talked to people of all different levels of intelligence and places in life. But I'll leave that alone, because being antisocial is difficult enough and you don't need someone pointing it out. But it is something to consider. You first have to reform your conduct. Now look at it from a philosophical perspective. Why might it be? Well, I mean, it's obvious. If you are obsessed with desires, then you're going to have a hard time maintaining a coherent train of thought. How do you build an argument involving a long process of deduction unless in the first place you're concentrating on it? So that's why you reform your conduct, giving up excessive indulgences so that then you can begin some form of meditative practice or form of mindfulness. You want to be able to build your concentration, and then you can build long sequences of argument, or you can pay careful attention to things in the world. So that's a prescriptive epistemological framework that's fairly universal. And before that conscious attention directing element, there's even maintenance of bodily health. If you don't maintain your conduct such as to preserve a certain state of health, then you won't be able to think clearly. Like, part of the way that we discern truth from untruth is the persistence of the perception. So you can see something that's an illusion. Say you're very, very sick, you're having some kind of fever dream, and you see, like, you're half asleep and you see someone walking around the room who's not really there, or something like that. When you're sick like that, it's hard to distinguish those sorts of things, those imaginary projections, from real persistent objects of the physical system in which we exist. So yeah, in order to know what's real, you have to maintain a state of health. That you also have to avoid drugs, you have to avoid stimulants of any kind, caffeine, nicotine, these sorts of things, to really be in a centered state of mind, and then to build a mindfulness practice that will allow for the construction of long sequences of argument and more careful reflection. And in my debate with Jay Dyer back whenever that was, I said essentially this as my prescriptive epistemological principle, that the more you can reduce the influence of emotions and desire, the more accurate your knowledge will be. That's the Pythagorean principle. And not in mathematics, but you first reform your conduct, give up those sorts of excessive desires, moderate your conduct, become clear-headed, and then you can start building into some advanced system of metaphysics. But yeah, that's it's interesting, there's a dichotomy then between a prescriptive epistemological framework and a descriptive. I don't know how much I've talked about my opinion at a descriptive level of epistemology, but I'm essentially an intuitionist, which it's a similar position to Kant, right? All of our knowledge is derived from intuitive faculties or functions within the mind that are opaque to us with regard to their ultimate origin. They're opaque at a phenomenological level. We can always build some kind of materialistic theory as to how they arrive in the first place or how they originate, but as presented phenomenologically, space, which is an intuition that we have, the way that we represent space, that is opaque. It's just given to us that space has these characteristics, and we all seem to share these properties of space in common. Space is a mental construct. We can't know that space inheres in the physical reality in exactly the same way in which it's represented to us. We have no way of bridging that gap with certainty. Or at least not prima facie. Chris Langan would actually argue against that. He would argue against the noumenal-phenomenal distinction. And I can now understand that argument, and I will go along with Chris Langan, but that's kind of like later on down the line when you build a whole system of philosophy, starting from first principles and metaphysics, then you can kind of understand why you can bridge that gap. But in the first instance, what am I saying? Instance is the word I'm looking for. In the first instance, space is presented as we know it as a mental phenomenon. The color green, the qualitative aspects are intuitively given as structures in the mind. And Chris Langan will resolve this distinction by recognizing that the syntax which governs mental things, cognitive things, will also have to govern physical things. Using the principle of syndifionosis, which says that any opposition is an opposition in the first place in light of some kind of higher syntactic medium in which the opposition is intelligible in the first place. So to have two objects, they have to exist in a common field. And that field has mechanics of its operations. If you want to think about it mechanistically or linguistically, two objects exist within a linguistic syntax which presents their meaning to us as distinct. That establishes the distinction. So in order to have distinction, you have to have a form of unity. So yes, this implies then that not necessarily reality as we think it may be, this kind of naive materialist conception of what the world is apart from us, not that space acts for it exactly as it does for us, but that a translation of state is possible between representation here and whatever else may be out there. Not to say that it's materialistic or mechanistic, or that space exists apart from subjectivity at all, but that a translation is ultimately going to have to be possible. I know this is very opaque to a number of people, probably almost everyone. But I can also arrive at the same justification for the elimination, the ultimate elimination that's not immediately evident between the noumenal and phenomenal, by saying that if reality is infinite, this is my starting point, then there can't be any limit from one line of perception to any other point in reality, or else there'd be a limit. So I can prove it very simply if you just use this one simple trick. Assume that reality is infinite. It really does a lot. You can derive all sorts of stuff from that. Spinoza did roughly the same thing, but arrived at different conclusions, or at least, I'm not an expert on Spinoza. I have listened to the Ethics, but it's kind of constructed like a geometric proof, where it starts with definitions and then like references numbered propositions, and that makes it very difficult if you're just listening to it. You kind of have to read it. But anyway, so I don't really know Spinoza's system. I know that Schopenhauer doesn't like it at all, and so it's kind of ironic that I'm a Schopenhauer guy, and yet I have a Spinozan kind of method. I think they can be resolved I think the underlying truth in both of them is there to be synthesized. But I told you this was going to be discursive, probably hard to follow. But anyway, you can eliminate that distinction, but that doesn't get away from our epistemological framework at first, from first principles being based in intuitions. If you reference logic, if you reference any empirical perception as the basis, or quality of empirical perception as the basis of your claims, as your evidential strength, all of that is based in intuitions that are ultimately opaque to us as presented phenomenologically. The characteristics of time-space causality, the classes of the categories of objects as they're presented, all of that is intuitively given, or it's derived from intuitively given material. So that's the descriptive epistemology. And that's kind of why, when we really start with philosophy, we have to start with the recognition of us being just here in a complex of material that is all mental in some sense, or at least phenomenological. We don't have to classify it as mental. This is what Husserl does with the phenomenological reduction, right? Drop all of our theoretical explanations and try just to describe. That's the basis of this descriptive epistemology I'm talking about, the phenomenological reduction. Just describe what exists as it exists. Do that as accurately as possible, and then maybe go away from the reduction back into theory building, and we can do it from a more solid foundation. So I agree with that method. That's my starting point, the phenomenological reduction, basically. I know that some of the postmodernists, like Derrida, have criticisms to make. I haven't read Derrida. I don't know what his criticism is. So for now, that's my opinion for epistemology. What is a starting point? Now, let's go back to why do philosophy from an individual perspective? Because if that's our starting point epistemologically, just identifying these factors of the mind and describing them, then we're kind of solipsistically isolated. Now, we can get into communication with others, but others only exist to us as representations of what they may be. They are mental identities. In a sense, you don't love anyone, really. You love what they are as they appear to you. People can love fictional characters. That kind of proves the point. We build attachments based on the evidence that we get, not like a direct, immediate perception of the other personality as it is, or at least we don't know that. Jay Dyer seems to think this, but I don't know why. So I'm kind of interested why he believes in direct perception and eschews the phenomenological view, which to me just seems self-evident, that we can't necessarily know, and Descartes came to this same conclusion, we can't necessarily know that there is anything in the first place beyond the mind. So anyway, we're reduced to this kind of solipsistic place if we stick just to that doubt. But how then do we justify the search of truth at all? Like, if we're just trapped here in this solipsistic perspective, why engage in philosophy? Why reform our conduct? Why seek to build a model of what the truth is? To build a concept of truth? Because of suffering. That's the easy way to explain it. Even from where we are, moral realism is evident. Even, accepting solipsism, you have good experiences, you have bad experiences. We are persuaded immediately by the intuitive character of these. They just are what they are. Suffering is what it is. Good feelings are what they are, and they have a force of their own, and this force impels us to run away from suffering and towards sources of pleasure. But suffering pretty much seems to outweigh pleasure as a rule, and so we are impelled towards philosophy as we run away from suffering. Because how do you run away from suffering? That's a critical question. And to answer that, you have to ask what is the dynamics, or what are the dynamics of positive and negative value? What are the dynamics of pleasure and suffering? How do I get the good and stay away from the bad? And there you've begun on ethics. But you find quickly that you can't actually do ethics unless you deal with epistemology. And you can't, even once you have epistemology, you still can't solve ethical questions unless you get into some kind of cosmological theory, escaping the solipsistic frame and answering the question, what may exist in terms of this good and bad outside of just my immediate experience here and now, because that's bounded by a horizon in time. We have a memory going back only so far, and the future is opaque, and so we're kind of boxed in the mental envelope. So if we want to know what the good and the bad are, how to have good experiences, how not to have bad experiences, you don't have to deal with it metaphysically. You can just deal with it pragmatically. You want to know the dynamic of the system so that you can avoid suffering. If you want to know how to do that, you have to know what the dynamics of the system are in the largest sense, and then that gets into not only cosmology but ultimately metaphysics. So the fact of suffering, if you really pay attention to it and recognize it and don't just dismiss it, which most people do automatically, suffering is real. You could be tortured. I could go travel to where you are, tie you up, and torture you for days, keeping you alive. That could happen. I won't do that, but it very well could happen. You could be tortured. You could be exposed to incredible suffering. And you don't know the limit of that. It may be that you could be exposed to incredible suffering forever. You could just be in that state. And the badness of it is self-evident because it's intuitively given. We can't make reference to any other form of value but that. This is the problem with J.S. distinction. He could say, well, I just don't care about suffering or positive value. When you say you don't care about it, you are making reference to it. You're saying, in light of this given intuitive dichotomy between positive and negative value, I'm making this value judgment, which negates the thing that I'm using to make the value judgment. It's contradictory. And what it ultimately boils down to is you're prioritizing a certain set of acts of valuation, namely those concerning the concept that you have, the representation that you have of a continuity of your genetic lineage. You're prioritizing those against any other set of value judgments, but you have no reason for doing so. Like, if the basis of that being good is the intuition of the good that you have, and it clearly is, at a phenomenological perspective, if you look at how you make the argument, you said you valued it. If you didn't say you valued it, your claim would be incoherent. So you said that you valued it. That stems from these intuitions. If these same intuitions apply to a broader set of acts of evaluation or valuation, then prioritizing one subset over the whole will ultimately end up being like a form of high time preference, and thus irrational, because why are you prioritizing that element over the others? But anyway, that's the problem with that existence versus experience dichotomy. Yeah, we are thrust into a world where we may endure great suffering. If you take it seriously, you will be impelled to discover the underlying dynamics so as to avoid possible hell. So, like, that's at the most, like, the deepest level why you have to build a philosophical system. And I do that from an earnest and honest perspective. I'm not constructing philosophical systems in a Machiavellian way because I think this is what's going to unite some political group. I do think that what I'm doing converges on that. I do think, in a sense, the end, from a human perspective, of philosophy is justice at a social level, just like Plato. But yeah, that's basically all I had to say. As far as I can tell, Pythagoras invented the term philosophy. Philosophy meant a way of life which likely stems from, or at least is very similar to, the attitude of the sannyasi in India, the path of renunciation, asceticism. And why that path? Because it gives you greater clarity, greater insight into the nature of things that allows you then to identify how it is that you come to suffer and how it is that you come to experience good things. And that, of course, will reinforce the precepts that you initially followed on faith. In order to begin this path of, first you have to reform your conduct. Well, naturally, people are fractious. They're going to ask, why? Why do I have to reform my conduct? You haven't proven to me anything. I don't even know if your philosophical system is right. That's why the Pythagoreans did not dismiss exoteric religion. They said, practice your exoteric religion. All perennialists say this, or the ones that I recognize as valid. Practice your exoteric religion. Follow its guidance. Follow those moral commandments, because they are shorthands for an underlying network of, or an underlying syntax of good and bad experience, how it comes to be. If you love your neighbor as yourself, love God with your heart and mind, that's a very shorthand way of approaching what you would approach through an elaborately drawn out system of ethics, culminating from some kind of like metaphysical founding principle. Schopenhauer builds a system of ethics like that. It's pretty rigorous. Other people build systems of ethics likewise, but kids have to follow moral commandments, and they do that on faith. So first you reform your conduct, then you gain greater insight and begin searching for wisdom, searching for truth. Then you get to advanced metaphysics. The problem is, with these things, people who call themselves seekers or even philosophers will often be more interested in these highly abstract things, and they'll forego the preliminary work that you have to do. You have to reform your conduct first. And I'll admit, I have not done this in a good way throughout my life. I was pretty, straight edge until college. The end of high school, I went downhill a little bit. In college, I went downhill, drank, smoked pot, that sort of thing. And then after college, I had my ups and downs, some really far downs where I was just indulgent and I pursued what I wanted, and I was interested in abstract metaphysics at that time, but it's fruitless. You're not going to get to the truth unless holistically you improve yourself. This should be obvious, because the greatest chess player in the world, Magnus Carlsen from Norway, exercises. The greatest mental athlete on the planet has to exercise his body. You have to exercise your body. You have to not drink, not smoke, to be the best at what you're doing. I went into music initially. That's what I wanted to do in college. I know I said I was done, but I guess I'm not. I wanted to go into music because I was talented, and it was easy for me to exceed the expectations of my teachers growing up and impress a lot of people. And so I thought, well, if it's that easy, I'll just do that, and that way I'll have to play in an orchestra, a few rehearsals a week, concerts, tour a few months maybe of the year, but I'll have a lot of time to devote to whatever I want to do. And that was, learning. I did want to study other things. I always have. I didn't always apply myself to it as much as I should have. But anyway, what I recognized at a higher level was that there are people who are totally all in with this performance thing. There are people who are not going to give up, who are going to practice far more than I was willing to practice, who are willing to schedule their lives around this pursuit. They engaged in that kind of basic conduct reformation first, and they were able to achieve levels of musicianship that I was not, because I lacked dedication to it. And I didn't have that commitment to it, so I wasn't going to be that person. It would have meant giving up everything else that I cared about. You have to do that for philosophy if you recognize how necessary it is. For the sake of philosophy, you reform your life, give up stimulants, practice, austerities, all of that. But yeah, my point was that you're never going to understand what reality is in the broadest sense. You're never going to get to the top of that craft, the craft of knowledge, I guess, unless you do all of that basic work first. So that's what we lack. How do we do that though? Because step one was usually follow an exoteric religion. Well, what if you can't have faith? What if you can't buy into it because you're just not persuaded by it? You just don't feel that conviction. You're not going to lie and go to church. Like, you don't choose to be persuaded by something, it seems. It seems like it has a persuasive thrust that comes from an intuitive factor within the mind, partly the apprehension of these arguments when they feel persuasive, or observing enough evidence, it clicks in you, and that's almost an involuntary process. Maybe volition's involved to some degree, but if you don't have that, how do you get this good conduct? Well, you can't just flip a switch and be good because you decide to. You can have a conscious desire to be good and still find yourself going down to the corner store and buying a pack of cigarettes right after you read some kind of Platonic text, or right after you read one of the Upanishads or something. You will, and I have, you will fail if you are addicted to things now. Particularly for me, it's been substances, nicotine, pot, alcohol, stuff like that. And sexual thoughts. Like, there is a problem that a lot of men have where they're out in public and every single woman of reproductive age, basically, who's like even halfway good looking, attracts your attention, and you start going into thought experiments of what could happen if, and like that, it drains your mental powers. It is really something you have to control. But if you haven't tried to control it in the past, you're under its thrall. That's the whole concept of positive liberty versus negative liberty. Negative liberty is freedom from oppression. Positive liberty is freedom from your own desires, because they do enslave you. They do control the course of your life. And if you could just step away from it, if you want to deny that and say, no, I could quit whenever I want if you're smoking, or I could go off into the woods, but that's stupid. Well, then do it and prove that you're not bullshitting. This has been a well-trodden path. There are tons of books you can read on people who have come to this same realization. You have to reform your conduct. You have to renounce desire. But how do you actually do it? If you don't have that conviction in some authority that tells you to do it, it's really difficult. And you have to go to the philosophy and start reading. But then how do you do that with discrimination if you haven't built up your mental, like you're in the first place, getting discrimination counts on stabilizing the mind, moderating conduct. So if you haven't done that, if you're not able to do that, how do you get into discriminating between the right path and the wrong path among all these gurus who are out there telling you, oh, I've got the right way for you, come subscribe to my lecture series, or donate to my YouTube channel. So you're really in kind of a quandary in that circumstance. And you kind of have to just, at that point, look to God and say, God, please guide me. I am lost. Admit that you're lost and look for guidance. I also think, like I said already, surrounding yourself with men of good character is a start. And hey, that dovetails with what I've said before, that we need to talk to one another. You can't just be a passive observer. You can't just have conversations that are self-indulgent. We need to consult one another about things that matter. We need to form true friendships based on philosophy, love of wisdom, and really at the end of the day, a desire to avoid suffering and survive. So, thank you for listening. And sorry if this was difficult to follow. But let me know what you think about this format, if I should just keep it to the shorter, more concise stuff. But thanks again. Bye-bye.